Ruby, and today's video is part 2 in the small series on the denial of death by Ernest Becker. If you haven't seen part 1, go ahead and check that out. And in part 1, I mentioned that Ernest Becker was a psychologist, but actually he was an anthropologist. And anthropology is the study of human cultures. So in part 2, we're going to go ahead and dive into the failures of heroism. So without further ado, let's get right into the video.
All throughout humankind's history, the masses have followed men of power. Oftentimes, they follow these larger-than-life men of power blindly into their own demise. Afterwards, they may see how foolish they were for blindly giving their loyalty to someone who didn't have their best interest at heart. Yet time and time again, the masses succumb to the appeal of these fascinating persons who hold or symbolize power. It seems to be a fact that men worship and fear power, and so give their loyalty to those who dispense it. Sigmund Freud noted that this same phenomenon can happen during psychoanalysis. The patient could develop an intense attachment to the person doing the analyzing. They would make the analyst the center of their world and their life. Freud called this transference because he believed that the patient was transferring the feelings they had towards their parents as a child onto the physician. They become dependent on him and draw protection and power from him, just as the child does with the parents. Freud saw transference as just another form of basic human suggestibility. This suggestibility is what made hypnosis possible. Hypnosis was a popular practice in the field of psychology at that time. In hypnosis, the patient passively surrenders to what they believe to be the superior power of the hypnotist. To the patient, it seems as if the hypnotist possessed supernatural power. However, it only seemed this way because of man's tendency to ignore the passiveness, suggestibility, and slavishness in their own soul. It's much easier for them to attribute their submission to the great power of something outside of themselves, rather than to accept that their submission is an unconscious motive and secret yearning. This unconscious motive is a result of repressing the anxiety of losing control and feeling powerless. We repress this anxiety by basing our whole conscious life on the false idea that we are self-sufficient and totally in control of our lives. The Hungarian psychoanalyst Sándor Ferenczi pointed out that the hypnotist must come across as an authoritative figure and speak in a similar manner as the patient's parents. He said, "Just those ways of frightening and being tender, the efficacy of which has been proved for thousands of years in the relations of parent to child. In our innermost soul, we are still children, and we remain so throughout life." This predisposition to the passiveness that allows one to be hypnotized is the same one that gives rise to Freud's transference. No one is immune to this. In one form or another, we all transfer this need to be dependent onto teachers, superiors, impressive personalities, or onto men of power that rule over the masses. Freud expanded on his theory of transference in his book, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. He explains how when great leaders rise up and the masses transfer their childlike dependence onto them, they can throw their own common sense out the window and do terrible things as long as their leader commands it. Many people attribute this phenomenon to humankind's herd instinct. Freud said, "It's not so much that man is a herd animal, but that he is a herd animal led by a chief. It is this alone that can explain the uncanny and coercive characteristics of group formations." In this sense, the masses are drawn to a powerful leader almost as if hypnotized. The Austrian psychoanalyst Fritz Rettel expanded on Freud's group psychology and showed that people were not only drawn into groups due to transference, but also due to a feeling of being called to heroism. Heroism, as we discussed in part 1, is one of the fundamental drives in man, and it can bring about or imitate religious experience, and helps us overcome the fear of dying by becoming an immortal figure in history. We can most clearly see how this drive towards heroism factors into group psychology in the example of the military. Most soldiers would never murder someone in their civilian lives. If they did, they would be consumed with shame and guilt. They are able to kill in the line of duty because their leader takes responsibility for the action by ordering it to happen. The soldiers, free of guilt, can now look on war as their sacred duty and call to heroism. Rettel wrote, "For them, it is holy aggression. For the leader, it is not." This is why when terrible leaders rise up, there are many people who will blindly follow them. The notorious cult leader Charles Manson is a prime example. He filled the role of the primal father, as Freud termed it, and his followers committed terrible murders at his command. Taking into account this theory of transference and the role it plays in group psychology, we can now view the darker side of human history in a new light. It's not so much mankind is naturally a lusty, destructive animal and lays waste around him because he feels godlike or invincible, but rather he is a trembling animal who occasionally does terrible things in an attempt to feel protected and supported by becoming part of the herd that follows a leader. In turn, the leader needs his followers to compensate for their own inability and fear of isolation. Now, once again, Freud has understood how humanity gets itself into trouble so well, but as for why they do it, he again attempts to reduce it to a purely sexual motive. In Freud's words, we have to conclude that all the feelings of sympathy, friendship, trust, and so forth, which we expend in life, are genetically connected with sexuality and have developed out of purely sexual desires by an enfeebling of their sexual aim. However pure and non-sensual they may appear in the forms they take on to our conscious self-perception. He never completely abandoned this view, but much later in his life, he noted the terror of the human condition and the childlike longing for a powerful father figure as protection of strange superior powers, caused by our human weakness and childish helplessness. And so we can say that transference isn't caused by sexual desire, but rather by cowardice. Alfred Adler referred to transference as fundamentally a problem of courage. And Otto Rank pointed out that the heroic immortality motive must bear the larger burden of our explanation of human passion. Now, the main problem that is caused by this is if we set up our perception of the world as a way to eliminate the anxiety caused by it, then we are fundamentally falsifying reality, creating a protective illusion to live in. William V. Silverberg gives a classic definition of transference. Transference indicates a need to exert complete control over external circumstances in all its variety and multiplicity of manifestation. Transference may be regarded as the enduring monument of man's profound rebellion against reality and his stubborn persistence in the ways of immaturity. The anxiety that is caused by life is what triggers one to create the illusion of transference. The more fear one experiences in life, the emptier they become, and the greater the need becomes to transfer the qualities they cannot find in themselves onto a powerful father figure that they can be dependent upon. Our fear of death underlies this all. This is why so many people are shocked, terrified, and upset when a leader dies, despite not knowing them on a personal level. When the object in which we transfer our dependence on dies, we are left feeling vulnerable as the illusion we have created deteriorates. Thus far, we have illuminated many of the negative aspects of transference, but this picture is incomplete. Transference isn't itself a bad thing, but rather it is misplaced transference that seems to get mankind into trouble. After all, humankind has a conscience, or a will to be good and do good things. Freud believed that as children, the conscious and idea of what is good was taught to them by their culture. The great philosopher Immanuel Kant believed that the conscious was one of the sublime mysteries of being and that all people were born with it. Everyone has an impulse to feel good about themselves, and we grow our self-esteem by doing esteemable acts. This is where the phenomena of transference and the instinctual drive towards heroism clash. On one hand, the creature is impelled by a desire to identify with the cosmic process, to merge themselves with the rest of nature. And on the other hand, they want to be unique, to stand out as something different and apart. The motive to lose oneself in something bigger stems from a fear of isolation and having to contend with one's own smallness and limitations. This, perhaps, is why throughout history, so many people have joined religious groups. It's not so much the fear of death that forms the basis of this motive, but rather the urge to fully live and find meaning in life. To fully embrace life is no easy task, because in order to do so, one must fully embrace all of the terror that life can cause. The drive towards heroism is meant to do exactly this. It allows one to fully embrace all that life has to offer. To stand on one's own and walk their own path towards this heroism creates the isolation we fear so much, hence the need for transference and to identify with the group. It allows one to strive towards heroism safely within the confines of a larger group. The problem here is that one can lose their individuality, which we crave so much, as they become merely a part of something else. So the question becomes, do we face the fear of standing alone against the vastness of our lives and all of its horrors, or do we face the fear of losing our individuality and not leaving behind a legacy of our own? Perhaps the solution to this problem is in fact becoming aware of it. We can't completely do away with transference, and we need other people. Carl Jung said of transference, it wants the human connection. That is the core of the whole transference phenomenon, and it is impossible to argue it away, because relationship to the self is at once relationship to our fellow man. In order to strive towards our own immortality, we need other people to be able to reach out to for support. After all, in all of our stories about heroes, whether they be ancient mythology or modern-day fiction, every hero has some sort of wise old man or other kind of helpers along the way. If we take a look at human history, we can see that human culture not only opposes nature, but transcends it. At its core, it is a heroic denial of our animal-like existence. The effectiveness of this denial has fluctuated over the centuries, but perhaps one of the most effective epochs has been under the reign of the Judeo-Christian culture. No matter how high or low someone was born, they were merely a part of a greater whole. The path to their cosmic heroism was completely mapped out for them. And so man's dilemma was fixed into place. He simultaneously needed to feel part of something greater than himself, while also needing to feel greatness within himself. With the decline of religious fervor in the post-Enlightenment world, who then could we merge ourselves with to be part of something greater in the absence of God? Otto Rank saw that the first solution to this problem was a romantic one. We fix this urge towards cosmic heroism onto another person in the form of a love object. The love partner becomes the ideal we strive towards. Rather than salvation coming from an abstract God in another dimension, we could seek it in an actual person here on Earth. Just listen to a few love songs and you can easily see how we have deified romance. Ultimately, however, the romantic solution to man's dilemma is doomed to fail. With romance comes sex, and sex is essentially an evolutionary mechanism made necessary by our own mortality. In Greek mythology, Eros and Thanatos are inseparable. Death is the natural twin brother of sex. We discussed in part 1 how sexual repression starts in childhood as a rejection of our strange mortal body and carries into adulthood in the form of sexual taboo. This is due in part to this primal act of procreation being nature's remedy to our decaying body, and so we must subconsciously repress and deny the fear attached to it. Even if one were to find the ideal love, if they tried to make it the sole judge of what was good and bad within them, they would basically be the reflex of the other person and lose themselves and your own identity. This is why so much resentment underlies so many relationships. When we narrow our source of cosmic heroism down to this world, we are still looking for the absolute, for the supreme self-transcending power, only now we must find it in the world. As in the romantic's case, another imperfect and decaying creature, such as ourselves, we are sure to be disappointed. This is why most people play it safe, choosing the standard transference objects like parents, bosses, or leaders. They accept the cultural definition of heroism to be a good parent or citizen. They sacrifice themselves for the immortality of the group rather than their own immortality. In order to stand on your own and choose your own heroic path, you must contend with one of man's worst fears, isolation. This is exactly what artists attempt to do. They become their own god by transferring onto themselves, or rather, their creative process. This creative solution has its issues as well. Not only must they contend with the loneliness that comes with walking their own path, but they are plagued with self-doubt. After all, who are they to play God? In this sense, the art they create is their justification of their heroism. Otto Rank called this their private religion. Søren Kierkegaard came to the same conclusion, that the only way out of the human dilemma is to renounce the world, to give one's life to the highest powers. This is what the artist attempts to do. They dedicate their life to their art. This is not easy to do. It's no wonder that historically, art and psychosis have such an intimate relationship. Here, Rank and Kierkegaard's beliefs join, that one should not settle for the cultural heroism or even the romantic or creative heroism. One should reach for the highest ideal of religion. Anything less than that, they are selling themselves short. It may seem like weakness and compromise to some thinkers. Friedrich Nietzsche was a colossal adversary of religion and railed on religious morality. But as Rank said, he overlooked the deep need in the human being for just that kind of morality. The need for a truly religious ideology is inherent in human nature. As far as Rank is concerned, neurosis has 3 distinct aspects. The first being universal, people's inability to live with the truth of existence. The second being personal, for each person has their own unique way in which they cope with life. And lastly, the third being historical. All the traditional ideologies that disguised and contended with neurosis have fallen away, and we are left with modern ideologies that are too thin to contain it. We are overwhelmed by life, so we only bite off as much as we can chew. In this sense, there is no clear distinction between the neurotic and the normal. Some of the lies we use to refuse reality work, and some don't. That is the only difference. When one tries to narrow their worldview too much, they can end up with obsessions, compulsions, and phobias of all kinds. This too narrow view is a result of the inability to repress the terror of life and death. The obsessive-compulsive person uses their compulsive behavior as a way to keep this terror at bay, and the one who suffers from the phobia must avoid the object which brings about this terror at all costs. The irony of this is, the narrowing of reality is meant to avoid death, but this avoidance is achieved by creating a life that isn't worth living. So on one end of the spectrum, we have a narrowing of the perceived world, as we said before, to only bite off what we can chew. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the people who bite off more than they can chew. We saw an example of this when we discussed the artists earlier. However, the difference between the artist and the neurotic boils down to talent. They both bite off more than they can chew, but the artist spits it back up as a work of art, whereas the neurotic chokes on it. Overwhelmed by the world he takes on, the neurotic reacts by criticizing themselves to excess. They can't endure themselves and the isolation that their individuality plunges them into. Their only option for a heroic endeavor is within a fantasy in their own mind. The problem is they cannot justify this symbolic fantasy heroism to others. Unable to connect with others in reality, they retreat deeper into their fantasy world, which is the only place they can experience their heroic self-glorification. To sum all of this up, we can look at the following excerpt from Otto Rank. With the truth, one cannot live. To be able to live, one needs illusions. Not only outer illusions such as art, religion, philosophy, science, and love, but inner illusions which first condition the outer. For example, a secure sense of one's active powers and of being able to count on the powers of others. Now, as far as the historical aspect of neuroticism is concerned, we can view human history as a succession of immortality ideologies. Then, the problem of mankind stemmed from these ideologies. Whether or not they can be fully embraced, how convincing, and how easy they make it for people to be confident and secure in their personal heroism. Viewed this way, one of the main issues of modern-day life is the failure of all traditional immortality ideologies to absorb and quicken man's hunger for self-perpetuation and heroism. This is why mental health issues are so widespread today. All of the convincing dramas of heroic triumph have disappeared. This perhaps is why mankind can't seem to stop themselves from going to war. It's one of the only stages man has left to act out their heroism on. With the rise of science and psychology, the need for religion to explain humankind in the world they live in was diminished. The problem is, this new ideology was lacking in the outlets for heroism. In Otto Rank's words, psychology, which is gradually trying to supplant religious and moral ideology, is only partially qualified to do this because it is preponderantly negative and disintegrated ideology. On this point, Rank and Kierkegaard's theories once again merge together in a mixture of psychology and religion. In their view, the neuroticism we have been discussing in psychological terms is exactly what Kierkegaard's more religious view would call sin. Rank sums this merging with the following. The neurotic loses every kind of collective spirituality and makes the heroic gesture of placing himself entirely within the immortality of his own ego. The neurotic type suffers from a consciousness of sin just as much as did his religious ancestor without believing in the concept of sin. Rank's devastating Kierkegaardian conclusion is, if neurosis is sin and not disease, then the only thing which can cure it is a worldview, some kind of affirmative collective ideology in which the person can perform the living drama of his acceptance as a creature. With the lack of ready-made worldviews in modern times, the neurotic attempts to create their own and fails. Kierkegaard's solution to this problem was to take a leap of faith on your own and find a transcendental support for your life that you can lean on and trust, outside of any existing rituals and independent of any church. Psychology, being a branch of science, largely focuses on cause and effect. Knowing how and why these problems come about is great, but that doesn't mean it offers a solution. Here Becker makes note that he is not trying to convert anyone to religious belief. As a matter of fact, if you wish, you can look at the religious view as just another illusion man has created to deal with the terrifying reality of our temporary life. However, it's an illusion that works. It allows one to direct their transference onto the abstraction of God which will not let them down like another person would. It frees the individual up to seek their own independent heroic self-justification while simultaneously allowing them to be part of something bigger than themselves without losing themselves to the earthly group itself. On top of all of this, the idea of an afterlife solves the death problem. From here, Becker goes on to show how mental illness fits into the framework of man's fundamental denial of death in an attempt to transcend it with heroic immortality. Alfred Adler revealed perfectly that depression is a problem of courage and how it develops in people who are afraid of life and have given up on their independent development, or in other words, their heroic efforts fail, and they give up and are defeated. The physician Willard Galen describes this failure in the following: dependency is the basic survival mechanism of the human organism. When the adult gives up hope in his ability to cope and sees himself incapable of either fleeing or fighting, he is reduced to a state of depression. In the case of schizophrenia, we have a person who, perhaps for biological or neurological reasons, has an inability to create what Adler called the life lie. They cannot repress the death anxiety through the normal means in which others do. Their overwhelming terror prevents them from coping with the external heroic transcendence that normal people strive for, and also from using transference as a way to feel safe by being dependent on others. Terrified and isolated, they retreat into their mind and create their own fantasy world, which is the only place they can live out their heroic transcendence and feel somewhat safe. They reject their physical body and the reality that it is in. They become untethered and are completely lost in their fantasy world, and only the symbolic self that exists in their mind remains. As we have discussed in more detail in Part 1, the death anxiety can be seen at the core of sexual perversions as well. No one has more to say on the subject than Freud. To put it plainly, the fetish is a substitute for the woman's phallus, which the little boy once believed in and does not wish to forego. The phenomenon he's describing here is what he termed castration anxiety. The developing child who is completely dependent on the mother learns about death. In this sense, their dependence is their lifeline, for without it they would surely die. In an attempt to repress this anxiety, they reject their dependence on the mother. If a child were to learn the shocking revelation that the female anatomy lacks a phallus during this crucial stage, they could develop the castration anxiety complex, where they associate the vagina with their death anxiety-inducing childhood dependence on their mother. Freud believed that this complex would either lead to homosexuality or fetishism, where the fetish object becomes a symbolic phallus, without which the anxiety-inducing vagina would leave them incapable of normal sexual practices. This is perhaps why the hermaphroditic image is so prevalent throughout human history. It symbolizes wholeness. This type of body-related issues can cause all sorts of sexual perversions. At the core of it, it's an attempt to find a way to cope with our own animal-like decaying bodies. These same body issues are what also leads to one to develop hypochondria. If the body represents our vulnerability, then we can look at our sexuality as how we transcend that vulnerability, mimicking the heroic transcendence we seek in other areas of our life. In Rank's words, in essence, sexuality is a collective phenomenon which the individual at all stages of civilization wants to individualize, that is, control. This explains all sexual conflicts in the individual, from masturbation to most varied perversions and perversities. All perversions, then, can be seen as primitive religions, as attempts to heroically transcend the human condition and achieve some kind of satisfaction in that condition. In all of the instances we have just discussed, and in many more that we haven't, we can see the common thread woven throughout all of these mental illnesses. The mentally ill cannot assume responsibility for their own independent lives. They are hyper fearful of life and death. In this sense, mental illness is just a failure to transcend death. The avoidance of life and the terror of death become enmeshed in the personality to such an extent that it is crippling. The result is that the person cannot permit himself the routine heroic self-expansion that other healthier people can. So what we really have is a case of failed heroics.